What is up? GoodMicWork, back at you. What you're about to watch here is a re-upload. As most of you know, recently, the WWE went through and blocked about a dozen of my videos on YouTube. A lot of my older pay-per-view and DVD reviews, and a few other commentaries where I had used some video footage, with no audio, just me talking over it, but somehow it got matched or reported or whatever, and WWE blocked the videos. I tried to dispute them. They all came back denied. No big deal, whatever, right? I wasn't monetizing these videos back then because I was using a little bit of video footage. I assumed it was all protected under fair use, but YouTube guidelines and copyright laws are all fucked up. Me, ever the optimist, I'm always positive. I make the best out of a horrible situation, and I'm not even that freaked out. Most of these videos that got taken down were 2 to 3, and I think maybe even 4 years old in some cases. So they're very old, but at the same time, it disappointed a lot of you that said, oh, I like going back and watching some of those old DVD reviews or whatever. So what I decided to do is re-upload all of them, and I'm just going to sprinkle them out to you, maybe like one a week here in the next, several weeks, just to kind of slowly get them all back in. They're going to lose a ton of views. Most of these had, 50, 60, 70,000 views on them. So I'm not going to get those type of numbers, obviously, on these videos, but these are just a way to give them back to you so you guys have them. All of the issues that the previous video had with the video footage I've just taken out. I've put the new graphics up, give you guys a more updated intro, and remind you to visit my website, GoodMicWorkCommentaries.com, and follow me on Twitter at GoodMicWork, like my Facebook page, and like this video. This video is going to need it. Since this is a re-upload, it's very old. I could use all the likes I can get, share it, and just enjoy the old content from me. I will warn you that these commentaries were mostly done with a really crappy microphone with no pop filter, so this is not my best work. It's not quite as sharp. It was still a hobby for me back then, and my YouTube channel was still in its infancy, and plus my opinions. Who knows what I even said? The statute of limitations on my opinions are gone. Don't give me shit in the comments about anything you hear here. I don't even remember what I said, so if you disagree with something, who cares? I probably don't even feel that way anymore. So I apologize for the dated content and the quality being a little bit less, but I didn't want the videos to completely go away. I figured I would just re-upload them to you so you can continue to enjoy them, and I can replenish my pay-per-view and DVD review playlist down below on my channel. So sit back and relax and enjoy an old school re-upload. This one's gonna be fun. I was so excited when we found out that the WWE was going to do a documentary on Paul Heyman's life. I knew that as soon as that DVD came out, I would do a review on it right away. I don't know how many of you have seen it yet, but I definitely say it's one of the WWE's best. I've been saying that for the last several documentaries that they have released. But this one I knew it was going to be especially good because Paul Heyman is one of those guys that just has an incredible story and an incredible track record in pro wrestling. He's been everywhere, and all of the places he has been, I have fond memories of, growing up and watching all the things he's done and the territories he went through, and basically the time in wrestling that all this was happening. It was just a great time, and I just have a lot of fond memories of some of these days. So I, for one, was really excited to watch the WWE's version of Paul Heyman's life and just to see exactly how much they talked about and how much they touched on and how in detail they actually got. And this was an awesome documentary, I have to say. They really did a good job of going through Paul Heyman's life. While I was watching the documentary, I was actually saying to myself, wow, I wish they would have gone into more detail on that. I wish we would have gotten the story on that. But then when I went through some of the extras, all of the great stories included in those, and we'll go through exactly what's on those in a little while. But they actually contained a lot of the juicy bits that I was looking for in the documentary. But even without those, the documentary was awesome. It was a fantastically told story. Paul Heyman has had a remarkable path through pro wrestling, unbelievable beginnings from where he started and the direction he took and how, focused and how determined he was, to make it through. Only a certain type of personality would be able to do what Paul Heyman did, especially when it came to getting his foot in the door of the wrestling business. And I've got to be honest with you, it's a question that I've gotten a lot. I should address it in my next Q&A or something like that. But, I think a case can actually be made for Paul Heyman to be the greatest wrestling manager of all time. I've always said that hands down, nobody can touch Bobby the Brain Heenan. I think he was the most entertaining manager there has ever been and one of my favorite personalities in wrestling. And I'm not taking away anything from Bobby. My fondest memories of wrestling managers all come from him. And there's really no other guy other than Paul Heyman that could even compete with Bobby Heenan on that level of being the greatest manager of all time. But when you think about where Paul Heyman is right now in his career, and all of the years he's been involved in wrestling, his tenure is actually just as long as Bobby the Brain Heenan's was. And Heenan was only a manager, I guess, from the early 70s till, the early 90s, or, maybe even before that. No, about the early 90s, so about 20 years, about the same as Paul Heyman. And when you look at the group of wrestlers that each guy managed, it's really a who's who. And as a matter of fact, Paul Heyman has managed a lot more world champions. I think something like 5 or 6, which I believe is a record. I don't think Blassie or Albano or anybody else managed that many world champions. I mean, Paul Heyman has had some big-time clients, under his wing. And then you think of all the different eras that he went through. He managed tag teams, he managed factions, he managed one guy at a time. He did a lot of different things that managers have done over the years, and he's just done it all. Not to mention, being a brilliant promoter, being members of creative teams in all sorts of different territories and wrestling companies. His unbelievable wrestling and business sense and his ability to, pass on this knowledge to younger generations, and basically is the perfect guy to go and get advice from. Not that you couldn't do that with Bobby Heenan. Bobby Heenan's one of the smartest men in wrestling ever. But Paul Heyman, when you look, at their body of work, each guy, I can understand the argument easily that, hey, Paul Heyman might be the greatest wrestling manager of all time, and he just might be. The story starts off right from his early days, like all WWE DVDs do, and Paul Heyman puts a lot of the credit for his success on his mother and her tale of being a survivor. She was a Holocaust survivor, went through absolute hell, and her determination and her ability to fight, to live, was what Paul Heyman believes was ingrained in him right from the day he was born, and he has that drive and ambition all because of his mother. Interestingly enough, Paul Heyman's first memory of wrestling, he gives credit to superstar Billy Graham. And to be honest with you, that was one of my first memories as well. They all kind of blend together for me, but I know one of the very first, wrestlers I laid eyes on television sitting on the floor when I was 3 years old in my living room was superstar Billy Graham. So watching superstar Billy Graham cut a promo and be charismatic and be entertaining as he was back then basically got Paul Heyman hooked on the business. And, just like a fan like myself or some of you would make a YouTube video today, he decided that he wanted to make a little wrestling newsletter and go to local matches, write about what happened, and then sell it through the mail. Very primitive times back then. No internet, no email, no text messages, no nothing. This is how you had to do things. This is how you had to get things done. And it was done on a very small level. How many people do you think Paul Heyman sent that newsletter to? A couple of dozen? And he was getting into photography at the same time, too. I believe he was actually taking pictures at some of these shows as well that he would include in the newsletter along with the story, and the results of the matches and what took place and all of that. And he tells the really funny story, Paul Heyman and his family are Jewish, of course, and he says that he invested all of his bar mitzvah money in like a printing press and shit like that so he can develop his own pictures and do his own work and all that crap, and he was going around to, the local promotions taking pictures, and he hustled his way in, to Madison Square Garden getting a backstage press pass at the age of fucking 14, took a bunch of pictures, and long story short, ended up presenting these pictures to Vince McMahon Sr., who liked him, paid him a little bit of money, and said, you're welcome to come back and take pictures anytime. And then Paul Heyman became one of those guys on the outside of the ring that took pictures, along with a guy like Bill Apter from Pro Wrestling Illustrated. That's a name in wrestling that's been around for decades. And they actually interviewed Apter for this, which is cool. A lot of people got interviewed for this. Actually, let me just run through the list of the people that were on this DVD. Now, these are just the ones I have written down. I might even be missing some, but we had Bill Apter, we had The Big Show, Stephanie McMahon, Joey Styles, Todd Gordon, interestingly enough, Gabe Sapolsky, Mick Foley, Tommy Dreamer, Edge, CM Punk, Dusty Rhodes, Jim Ross, Raven, lots of other guys. Just a really cool, group of guys that they were able to interview for this. It would have been cool if they were able to, get Taz or the Dudley Boys or some of those other ECW guys that are in TNA right now. It would have been nice to hear what they had to say about a few things. But for the most part, I was completely fine with the guys that they brought in to interview for this documentary. But getting back to what Bill Apter was saying about Paul Heyman, he was saying that nobody fucking liked him. He's this young, pushy, obnoxious kid, that has no fucking regard for anybody else, no common courtesy or anything like that. He's bumping into him. And Apter said, that Paul Heyman cost him thousands of good pictures by bumping into him and fucking up his shots and shit like that. So it sounded like Paul Heyman, to a degree, was a huge pain in the ass. So I kind of found it funny that people were talking about how annoying Paul Heyman was when he was a teenager fucking around backstage at MSG. Pretty funny shit. But because of this backstage access that Paul Heyman had and him getting his foot in the door, he was able to hobnob with guys like Classy Freddie Blassie and the Grand Wizard and Captain Lou Albano, some of the greatest wrestling managers in the history of the business. You know, he's sitting there talking to, learning from, picking their brain, absorbing everything they're giving him. That's another reason why I think Paul Heyman can make a case for being the greatest wrestling manager of all time, because he didn't appear out of nowhere. He was in the backstage area from the time he was 13 or 14 years old, learning from the greatest people in the business at a young age. Wrestling has been a part of him for his whole life. Paul Heyman is like a Chris Jericho or a Chris Benoit or a CM Punk in wrestling, somebody that traveled the world, learned many different styles in many different areas and worked for many different promotions and learned the art of pro wrestling in many different styles. And that's the same type of experience Paul Heyman brings as a wrestling manager. Now, by this time, Heyman had gotten to know a lot of people in the wrestling business, made some friends. You know, he was basically in the door now. And he was going to be bringing, I think he said Jimmy Garvin, for whatever reason, I can't remember, over to Studio 54 in New York, big nightclub. And it basically seems like he just fell ass backwards into this opportunity. One of the photographers, or the lead photographer for the nightclub, apparently got fired or something happened, and Paul Heyman was saying, hey, I can do that, I'm a photographer, and he got the, lead photographer and promoter gig at fucking Studio 54, and he was a goddamn teenager. So like I said, just a very ambitious kid, very determined and completely full of shit, and he'll basically do whatever he has to do to get ahead. And he did do some wrestling events there. And I think he said the first thing he ever promoted was an award that he was going to be giving to Ric Flair, because the NWA just happened to be in Philadelphia, the same night of some big weekend that he's going to be doing some shit at Studio 54, invites him to come over, gives him an award, and also debuts Bam Bam Bigelow, who had trained in New Jersey and is from there, and he was going to be launched onto the scene, in this big Studio 54 show. So they talked a little bit about that, but now we're getting into the mid-'80s, and Studio 54 is long past its heyday, and they actually go out of business due to competition from a rival. So I guess from here, Paul Heyman starts just making the rounds around the independents, doing commentary and shit, and I guess a lot of people are saying, hey, you should be a wrestling manager. You've been hanging out with Blassie and Albano and Wizard. Why don't you fucking do that? So I guess after some coaxing, he decided that he will become a wrestling manager, and I think he was managing the Motor City Madmen first, and he picked his name as Paul E. Dangerously, because the movie that came out in the mid-'80s with Michael Keaton called Johnny Dangerously, and he said that he, in his younger days, resembled Michael Keaton, and basically kind of stole the name from the movie. But what's interesting about this is I always thought, back in the mid-'80s when I would see Paul Heyman on TV, I didn't think he looked like Michael Keaton at all. I thought he looked like a Belushi. More specifically, Jim Belushi. Not John Belushi, who was on SNL and was in great movies like Animal House. I'm talking about his brother, Jim. I thought Paul Heyman looked identical to Jim Belushi. I think if you put a pair of giant 80s sunglasses on Jim Belushi and gave him a big obnoxious telephone and put him out on TV, you would not be able to tell the difference between him and Paul Heyman. At least at that time, you wouldn't have. Well, shit, they actually probably still look alike to this day. But anyway, from here, Paul Heyman really starts getting all over the fucking wrestling map. I think one of the first things he did once he became Paul E. Dangerously was going down to Florida with Kevin Sullivan, but then Jim Crockett Promotions bought out Florida, so he was out of business. Then he went over to Memphis, and this was one of the things watching the documentary that I was like, why the fuck are they not talking more about this? This was such a big deal back then. I remember this shit. And luckily, they go into more detail on it in the extras on the second disc of this DVD, thank God. But at first, I was like, I can't believe they're not talking more about Memphis. But, he had a lot of problems with Jerry Lawler down there. It was a big break for him. He became highly successful, and they put him with Austin Idol and Tommy Rich, who were huge heels in the territory. And I remember when they shaved Lawler's head. Now, I did not get Memphis wrestling where I was. I was only able to watch WWF, NWA, and AWA as a kid. I never got any Memphis wrestling on TV, but I did see a whole lot of shit in the wrestling magazines because I was psychotic about buying wrestling magazines back then. That was the only way to keep track of the product. I would go to the newsstands and buy 4 or 5 issues at a time and just, fucking read through them. And I remember seeing the pictures and reading the articles, with Lawler getting his head shaved, and it was fucking unbelievable. I wish I could have been, in a building that night when something like that happens. Memphis was such a hot, passionate territory. Those Southern fans took the shit a lot more seriously, I think, think, than northern fans, and shit just could really get ugly, you know, in some of those southern territories. And Memphis was, you know, so hot, and Lawler was the king of that territory, and it's been such a great wrestling town. You know, when that happened in Memphis and they fucking shaved his head, you know, that was a big deal. I'm surprised they got out of there alive. And it was during his time in Memphis, you know, that he had the heat with Jerry Lawler, and they had the incident where Jerry Lawler broke his fucking jaw. And unfortunately, they don't give us any of those juicy details on the documentary. They would come in the extras. They also didn't go into that much detail in his run in the AWA. I do remember seeing him on ESPN, because AWA would be on ESPN every single fucking day, right in the middle of the afternoon sometime, and I would see him on there a lot. And I just wish the documentary, I wish we would have heard Paul Heyman. I would have loved to hear what he said about Vern Gagne. Maybe the WWE doesn't want to touch too much on Vern. From what I understand, he is still alive, but he's got dementia, and I believe he killed somebody a couple of years ago because he thought he was back in the ring, and he's just completely fucking out of his mind. I don't think he's dead yet, but maybe the WWE just feels like it's somebody they don't want to touch on. So they didn't really talk very much about Paul Heyman's time in the AWA, but I would have loved to hear his opinions on what it was like there, who he got along with, who he did like, who he didn't like, and basically just his overall experience there. But he was managing the original Midnight Express in the AWA and ended up jumping down to Jim Crockett Promotions because Tully and Arn had left for the WWE to become the Brainbusters when there was all sorts of fucking dissension in WCW. I think they were going through their sale to Ted Turner, and things were just getting fucked up and a little bit political, and Arn and Tully left. So they needed a team. WCW needed a team to feud with Jim Cornette's new Midnight Express. So they brought Heyman and those guys down to feud with Cornette's, tag team. And I remember those days. That was great shit. I remember watching that fucking shit on Saturday night in the 80s. It was just, the memories. But unfortunately, it didn't last very long. That feud seemed like it was over before it started, and they didn't really have anything for Paul Heyman, and I think they put him on commentary. And in this part of the documentary, he really puts over Jim Ross. And it's just so amazing how lucky he is, all the guys he learned from a young kid, in that generation, moving all the way up, and got to learn from the likes of Jim Ross. He literally learned from the best wrestling managers, the best wrestling promoters, and the best wrestling announcers in the business. And he excelled in all three of those categories in wrestling. Just amazing shit. And he talked about how much he learned from him and how much he credits all of his success, especially as a commentator and understanding, the performing of wrestling and the performing aspect of it, learning how to tell a story. He learned so much from Jim Ross and really gives him a lot of credit in the DVD. It was really cool to hear that. Now, Heyman was always at odds with management, it seemed like, in every company he had ever been in, so WCW was pissed at him. I believe they suspended him, but ended up bringing him back when Ravishing Rick Rude was signed to the company, and Paul Heyman tells the story in the DVD how, I think it was Crockett's idea to come up with basically a modern-day Four Horsemen. Flair at this time was in the WWE, so a Four Horsemen rebirth in WCW was impossible, so they basically wanted to make a new group, with Paul Heyman playing the role of J.J. Dillon. Ravishing Rick Rude will be the centerpiece like Ric Flair. Arn Anderson is in the group, Larry Zbyszko is in the group, and Bobby Eaton is in the group. And then they also add a young guy from WCW's roster who would go on to become, just probably the most over wrestler in the history of the fucking business, Stunning Steve Austin. They even brought in Medusa to play the role of Baby Doll, so they had basically recreated the Four Horsemen, the Dangerous Alliance. I remember these times. I remember how they started. I remember when Rick Rude was coming out in the mask as I forget what they were calling him, the Phantom or something like that. I should have brushed up on my history, but I do know when the group was basically debuted, Paul Heyman was using this group as a way to exact revenge on WCW for firing him or whatever. So, I just remember them being on TV all the time, every single fucking week. It was the Dangerous Alliance versus somebody, and Paul Heyman and that big, stupid, obnoxious cell phone, which, when you look back at the tapes, all the different footage of Paul Heyman playing that gimmick, half of the time, he wasn't even out there with a cell phone. It was a fucking cordless phone, a basic household cordless phone, even with a big, stupid, long metal antenna sticking out of the top of it. I'm like, who are you trying to fool here? But he was great back in those days. I even remember watching, that faction in WCW and thinking that they would be great in the WWE. I actually think Paul Heyman would have been great in the WWE in the early 90s. I mean, a lot of their shit was so character-based and cartoony, but Paul Heyman was sort of like that. He was like a really animated Jewish businessman, completely nuts and obnoxious, So he was sort of like that. He could have fitted that mold. He would have been fine in the WWE. I would have loved to see Cornette and Heyman go at it in the early 90s in the WWE. When Cornette was there managing Yokozuna as WWE champion 93, 94, I would have loved to see Paul Heyman come in and bring the Paulie Dangerously gimmick with him. It would have been great shit. They could have found all sorts of great stuff to do. It would have really helped the WWE at that time because their product was shit. Now, Paul Heyman's exit from WCW is a little touchy. It seems like he was always at odds with somebody. Well, Bill Watts has been accused of being a racist more than once. And Paul Heyman says in the DVD outright that he will not mention a thing about him leaving WCW or the lawsuit that he filed against them. He sued them. And apparently there's a gag order on each side. Nobody can talk about it, discuss the terms of the case or how much money he got, but he did get a big chunk of money from WCW. And I'll tell you what it was about. It was about Bill Watts and the fact that he's been accused of being a racist son of a bitch. He has adamantly denied it over the years, but hey, he's a Texas good old boy. I don't think he necessarily hates Jews and hates black people, but you can't tell me there is not some racist thoughts in his bones. I'm sure it probably runs in his family and it's all ingrained in the culture down there. So I think he said a few things out loud that he shouldn't have, got him in all sorts of trouble. And don't forget, this is TBS, home of the Atlanta Braves. Hank Aaron, I think, is working in the front office at the time, and he is extremely offended about what Bill Watts had said. And when you combine this with the anti-Semitism claims that Paul Heyman was putting on them, Bill Watts was out the fucking door, and Paul Heyman won a huge settlement. Good for him. Now, from here is where he heads over to ECW. Now, it was only Eastern Championship Wrestling back then. Todd Gordon was the owner. Eddie Gilbert was the big star there. Paul Heyman and Eddie were good friends, and Eddie invited him to come up and, maybe make some TV appearances, work with some of the young guys, whatever, while he, worked on his deal with Crockett. They were actually going to start their own wrestling promotion and go big, try to compete with Vince and the whole thing. I don't remember where they were going to base it out of. I don't think it was going to be North Carolina. I actually think it might have been Texas. But they were really seriously talking about starting up their own wrestling company. So in the meantime, Paul Heyman was going to do some work in ECW. Well, long story short, the whole Crockett thing falls through. Paul Heyman starts getting more and more involved in ECW, ends up becoming the booker, completely takes himself out of the managerial role, and now he's in charge of, storyline direction in ECW. And I remember how much press it got when they did the NWA title trashing and the way they fucked over Dennis Corluzzo like that. I think it was one of the more rotten things Paul Heyman had ever done, but he was only doing it, for the future and the good of his company and all of that. But still, to take a piss and a shit basically on that title the way they did. I know the NWA there was nothing left of it. That title was completely meaningless and washed up and dead and was being defended around the country in front of, literally dozens of people at a time. And Paul Heyman wanted to take ECW in this direction, this adult, this R-rated, this more mature type of storylines, and just to be so defiant, and just so vile as he was, throw down the title, say it's a piece of shit, crap all over its lineage and its history, and say, we are ECW, we are no longer Eastern Championship Wrestling, we are Extreme Championship Wrestling. And this is when they started bringing in the violence and the crazy storylines, really over-the-top storylines that really crossed the line, a lot of them. Everybody talks about the crucifixion angle, the angle that sent Kurt Angle out of ECW. Some of the shit they were doing with Raven and the Sandman's son and all of that stuff. So they really had some hardcore angles going on, not to mention the sex, the violence, the blood, the fire, the thumbtacks, the barbed wire, the tables. I mean, they brought everything, left nothing out, basically were willing to try anything and be as creative as possible. And man, they really got over. Such a cult following back then. I remember ECW during its heyday, living in the South and just watching the way the culture was up there in Philadelphia and New York and how rabid those fans are. And I thought it was really cool, the WWE, they really made a point not to make this an ECW DVD because ECW is a big part of Paul Heyman's life, but there's a lot of other stuff in Paul Heyman's life and a lot of other parts of the story that need to be told. And I'm glad that they didn't really, obsess with ECW too much. They made the DVD on them a few years back, The Rise and Fall of ECW, which incidentally is my most requested DVD review that I do. But because I had plans to do the Paul Heyman DVD, I didn't want to overdo it with ECW stuff. So the ECW DVD will come in the future, but, for right now, I thought it would be overkill. But all the former ECW talent that they interviewed in this documentary spent, a good amount of time, probably 15 or 20 solid minutes, really talking about the creative genius of Paul Heyman. and what a great leader and motivator he was, a master manipulator, and he really helped structure, a team mentality in ECW. Those guys felt like they were fighting against, these two giant establishments, WCW and WWE. They needed to be united in order to stand a chance against these guys, and Paul Heyman was able to convince them, to go out there and kill themselves for no fucking money, and sometimes, bouncing checks and shit on them. So the fact that Paul Heyman was able to convince these guys to do what they did, to work as hard as they were, and to be as loyal as they were, just shows, what a great hustler the guy fucking is. And an interesting side note, something I noticed on the DVD, you'll probably find this interesting, when they were talking about how great Paul Heyman is at being a leader and how he can motivate his wrestlers to basically go out there and do anything. They showed a clip from Beyond the Mat, the clip where he was giving the speech, I think, before the first pay-per-view. What I found interesting about the clip is they gave credit to not Beyond the Mat, but they gave credit to Universal Studios licensing. It was almost as if the WWE did not want any mention of Beyond the Mat on there. I don't think they really like the fucking movie. I think they're ashamed that they ever took part in it because of how bad it made wrestling look. And it wasn't until the end of the DVD, at the very end, they do give a credit to Beyond the Mat after the documentary is over. But during the documentary, they do not put Beyond the Mat on the screen. They just put the name of the film studio. They also talk about the interesting relationship between ECW and the WWE and the support that they got from Vince McMahon and the company. I remember these times in the mid-90s so vividly when ECW was really getting on the map, especially in 1995. I remember in 1995 a couple of different times, King of the Ring, most specifically, was really famous because it was in Philadelphia, and the WWE was still so ridiculously out of touch. Mabel won the King of the Ring that year. They had ridiculous characters and a bunch of crap, and ECW, they were full on into their new persona of being adult-oriented and violent and, basically more R-rated. And the WWE is in these guys' backyard. And the fans were fucking going nuts over some of the stuff the WWE was doing on this show. And I think that's one of the first times that Vince realized, wow, Paul Heyman might actually have something here. And the next time they went back to Pennsylvania was at the In Your House in December, and Brett and Bulldog had a bloody brawl. I think they learned a lot in that short amount of time that, hey, if we ever go back to this area, there is a different type of fan base here. Their local promotion is geared towards blood and guts. So if we're going to go perform in front of this audience, we cannot give them clowns and plumbers. So WWE smartened up real quick, and they were working with ECW. I mean, Paul Heyman and Vince McMahon were regularly talking, and you could sense that, even back then before the internet was in full swing and you had dirt sheets and fans fucking knew everything, you knew that ECW has a better relationship with the WWE than they did with WCW. And a really interesting rumor was cleared up too. We've been hearing for years, I've always been under the assumption that Paul Heyman and ECW were being supported by Vince McMahon. The term $1,000 a week has been thrown out several times and verified by a few different people. So we all knew that back in the 90s, specifically 1996 until whenever, the WWE was paying ECW $1,000 a week. I was always under the assumption that this was because Vince McMahon wanted to keep Paul Heyman close. He was taking some of his talent. Some people have said, oh, Vince did it out of the kindness of his heart, and he might have. Vince is actually, a lot of people will back up the story that Vince, really helps him out. He's always there for him. He always takes care of his people. He's done multiple favors and given multiple loans to multiple wrestlers over the years. And, for him to help out Paul Heyman, giving him $1,000 a week, because WWE is taking some of their talent here and there, that's part of the reason. But I think the other part of the reason is that he wanted to keep Paul Heyman close. He didn't want Paul Heyman striking any sort of a deal with WCW. Not that he would after the lawsuit and all that shit, but, there's the whole Mole storyline, which as I was watching this documentary, like I said in the beginning, I'm like, wow, they're not going to touch on that at all, but that would come in the extras. We'll get to that in a bit, but I think Vince McMahon wanted Paul Heyman on his side, and I think WWE saw that ECW, this was an early form of a developmental territory, because anybody that got over in ECW, and I think this was Vince McMahon's mindset when he was giving ECW the $1,000 a week. He was thinking to himself, I want Paul Heyman to be loyal to the WWE, and if he is able to create the next megastar, if somebody down there gets hugely over, they are not going to be able to stay in small ECW. They're going to have to jump and make the big jump to make the big money. But where are they going to jump? I think Vince McMahon wanted to make sure that if that next guy came around, he was going to be coming to the WWE. But back to the $1,000 a week point, Paul Heyman actually clears it up for us. He actually said that he never took any money from the WWE personally. Yes, ECW was paid $1,000 a week, but not for the reason people think. Vince McMahon wasn't supporting Paul Heyman on the side. Paul Heyman says that it was because of Too Cold Scorpio. When the two sides traded some talent, and that's kind of when you knew WWE and ECW were in cahoots. I remember when Al Snow left WWE and went over there, Droz went over there, I forget somebody else, but the WWE brought in, I think, Furnace and LaFon. They wanted a new tag team to go up against Owen and the Bulldog and Too Cold Scorpio, who they made Flash Funk. I'm pretty sure both of those teams debuted at the Survivor Series in 1996. And apparently ECW had some sort of a deal with Tommy Boy Records where whenever Too Cold Scorpio would come out to the ring, they would play some of their music and then show an ad for them later in the show, and Tommy Boy would pay ECW $1,000 a week, to do this. So when Vince wanted to bring over Too Cold Scorpio, ECW was going to lose that $1,000 a week, and when Paul Heyman told Vince McMahon this, Vince said that he'd cover the $1,000 a week. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I never knew that. I never put that together. I always thought Vince McMahon just funneled a little cash down to ECW from time to time just to help keep them alive. Now, with that being said, throughout this entire DVD, everybody has made reference, including Paul Heyman himself, what a pathological fucking liar he is. So if he's telling this whole story about the $1,000 a week and Too Cold Scorpio, who the fuck even knows if he's telling the truth or not? His credibility is kind of ruined at this point. And speaking of Paul Heyman being a liar, they also talk a lot about ECW's problems, their financial problems, and how crazy Paul Heyman was, and sometimes he would lie to your face or bluff about something just to keep his company going in the right direction, and he openly admits that and says, hey, I respect that criticism and understand it, but I was just doing what I had to do to survive and keep my company alive, and I would do anything it took. It's my family's fortune, my parents are investors, all of my money is tied up in this thing, and he would just do anything to ensure, his safety and the fact that his company, was stayed alive. That's it. He used that as his number one motivation, and anytime he did anybody wrong, that was his excuse. It's just for the company. He just did it, whatever he had to do. So he did a lot of unethical things. He did a lot of dirtbag things, sleazy things. A lot of people were bitter towards him for a lot of years. Tommy Dreamer, incidentally, in the documentary said something really interesting. He said he was one of the people that was really bitter towards Paul Heyman for a long time for some of the shit that he did in ECW, and that he's gotten over that now, and he hears a lot of former guys, still being pissed off at Paul Heyman for the way he did business, and he kind of had a nice little spin on it. He said, well, number one, you could have left anytime you wanted. Nobody's forcing you to stay there. You can leave. If somebody bounces a check on you, then you fucking leave, or call the cops, take the guy to court, do anything. It was their prerogative to stay, and if they didn't like the way the company was being run, even though it was being run like shit, they had the option to go if they wanted. But they didn't go. They stuck around. And Tommy Dreamer said something very telling. He goes, it was a great time in your life. Stop your fucking bitching. And, yeah, you might have had a check bounced on you here or there, or been treated, poorly or improperly or something like that. But still, you wouldn't have amounted to anything in the wrestling business without Paul Heyman's help anyway. So it was either that or nothing. And he's right. Think about guys like Steve Corino, Danny Doring, Roadkill. All those guys, I guess, are okay individually in their own way, but they were never going to make it on the big level. Those guys didn't have the look. I think Steve Corino was actually one of the most unattractive wrestlers I've ever seen. I always thought the guy looked like shit, but he could put on a good, hard, violent match. He was a good promo, and he had a lot of the tools, even though he didn't have the look. So a lot of these guys weren't going to get anywhere, without a company like ECW. So Tommy Dreamer was right. It was a great time. It was a memorable time. It was the hottest time in the business, and those are memories these guys can look back at and fondly for years. So basically, Tommy Dreamer's message is just move on. But some of the stories they were telling in the DVD of some of the fucked up shit that went on in ECW, I wouldn't be able to work there. I would have walked out the door the first fucking day. I love Paul Heyman and everything, but some of the shit these guys are talking about, no fucking way. Not in a goddamn million years. Rob Van Dam was saying that they sometimes flew on bereavement fare. Can you fucking believe that? They actually had the wrestlers call the airline and lie, tell them that a family member died so they could get a discounted plane ticket. How fucked up is that? So this company just ran day to fucking day. It never seemed like they could get ahead. And they were over. They were so popular. ECW was huge, in the mid to late 90s there. I mean, their pay-per-view buy rates were good. Their arenas were selling out. Their merchandise was flying off the shelves. It was, it was a cool, hip thing to like. If you were a young adolescent boy before the Attitude Era came along, you were pretty cool if you liked a company like ECW. So the fact that they couldn't pull it all together and just get their shit together and their affairs in order and manage the company properly with all of their money money that was coming in, you know, it's a shame because think about TNA. How the fuck does that company stay in business? They're not even a third as popular as ECW was. And I think it's because at the end of the day, even though TNA does a lot of fucked up shit, and even though that company is a mess, they are a business that is functioning like a proper business should. They don't have their tag team champions running the fucking office. They have office people to handle that sort of thing. They have merchandise people to handle that sort of thing. You know, ECW had no infrastructure at all. And it seemed like the place was just a constant clusterfuck, you know, and they wound up having money problems, a lot of money problems, where Paul Heyman ended up finally filing for bankruptcy. And it's sad when this happened. Right after WWE bought WCW, ECW also closed its doors. You know, WCW and ECW died, you know, at the same time. And I really think ECW got a raw deal. They had a terrible TV deal with TNN, or I don't know if it had become Spike TV by then. I don't think so. I don't even fucking know. But they all of a sudden had to worry about standards and practices. They only had an hour show. It was a terrible time slot. They never got advertised, never got promoted. The company, you know, the TV station treated ECW like a fucking piece of shit. And then when WWE was leaving USA Network and jumped over there, that kicked ECW off. They had nowhere to go. And without a TV deal, the company isn't worth anything. That's why this whole Spike TV and TNA, you know, TV deal recently is such a big deal, because if this deal falls through, if they don't stay on Spike TV and they get canceled, they could be fucked. So it's really a shame looking back on it. But then again, you know, the buyout from WCW had just happened. I don't even know if there would have been a place. You know, once those two big companies merge, I don't know what ECW could even do. WWE was already attitude. They had already stolen the concept. So it's not like ECW could go back to basics and do what they did before by being violent and crazy, because now we've seen violent and crazy. It's no longer new. And I don't think at the time ECW had the talent or the capability to come up with a brand new concept that's going to light the world on fire, because the Attitude Era was still in full swing. Wrestling was hugely over. The buyout, the WCW and WWE merger was the fucking talk of the town. So there was nothing that any other wrestling company could do that was going to overshadow that. So ECW was just basically SOL. And I remember when Paul Heyman showed up on Raw that night, word had leaked before the show. I can't remember how now, but I do know that during the day I somehow found out that Paul Heyman was there. So I knew he was going to be debuting on Raw. And it's odd, I don't know if I've ever talked about this subject, but Paul Heyman's debut in the WWE tied in with Jerry the King Lawler leaving the WWE because they released the cat. And I remember being fascinated by this story, because at the time, nobody hated Jerry the King Lawler yet. He wasn't an annoying, obnoxious, stupid fucking wrestling commentator. He was actually pretty good. And when you combine him with Jim Ross during the heyday of Monday Night Raw, they were a great broadcast team. And so the WWE releases his 17-year-old girlfriend, the cat, and he gets pissed. He goes, "Why the fuck did you do that? You'd have to know I'm going to leave with her." So he has this huge falling out with the WWE. It's funny how Jerry Lawler missed the entire invasion almost exactly. I think all of this went down just a week or two before WWE purchased WCW. Jerry the King Lawler returned to the WWE at a show that I was at in Charlotte the night after the Survivor Series 2001 when he returned, which was basically the night after the invasion angle was over. And of course he had to support his girlfriend, and he left with her. This was one of the main reasons, ironically. You think about how storied Jerry Lawler's career is and all of the great things that he has done and all the wonderful stories that he can tell. But it was the situation with the cat and him leaving the WWE that actually led me to buy his book. I probably would have bought it anyway, just because I like reading about the old days, but the main reason I bought it is because I wanted to hear him tell the story of what the fuck happened when he left the WWE and went home with the cat, and then they broke up and he came back to the WWE. So he originally left in support of her, and as he's gone, continuing to work the independents like he always does, she ends up fucking cheating on him or something like that. Big surprise, Jerry Lawler breaks up with another fucking teenager. So now they're done. There's no issue there anymore. He doesn't give a fuck about her, so he's ready to come back to the WWE. So he shows up, ironically, as Paul Heyman is being carried out of the arena. Remember that? The night after the Survivor Series on Raw, he comes strutting out there to do commentary as if nothing happened the night before. And I can't even remember now. I think it was Vince. I think Vince was the one that threw him out and then brought back Jim Ross's good old partner, Jerry the King Lawler, and he comes out pointing and laughing at security who is dragging Paul Heyman out of the arena. And also, given the history between Paul Heyman and Jerry Lawler from back back in the Mid-South Coliseum days, you know, it's just ironic how that all tied in together. And in all my years of doing commentaries here and all my Q&As, I don't think anybody has ever asked me about the Jerry Lawler-Cat situation when Lawler left the WWE. But it was almost just perfect timing for everything. You know, ECW was about to fold, Lawler was leaving, and a huge time. They were building for WrestleMania. I mean, to lose, you know, one half of the voice of your show is a big deal, you know, when they're coming up on a show that's so big and it's such an important time in wrestling with WWE buying WCW. And I was actually really worried. You know, when the news story broke online about what had happened between Jerry Lawler and WWE, we were like, what the fuck are they going to do on Raw? What's going to happen? I mean, I was actually a little bit worried. At the time, Jerry Lawler was a big part of the show. Now, if the WWE lost Jerry Lawler, no big deal, commentary sucks anyway. But back then, you know, Lawler was an integral part of Raw. So for them to bring out Paul Heyman was like, wow, they landed on their feet because Paul Heyman is fucking great. I absolutely loved him on commentary during those 8 months. He was reunited with Jim Ross from WCW, and, you know, Jim Ross talks about how badly Paul Heyman pushed his buttons. For as much respect as Paul Heyman has for Jim Ross said he was legitimately pissed off at Paul Heyman constantly. I absolutely loved Paul Heyman's energy. He was so intense on commentary. He really helped tell the story of what a humongous time in wrestling this is. And looking back now, it seems almost fitting. I'm glad it was Paul Heyman on commentary the night that Vince McMahon was in the ring doing the simulcast with Shane McMahon on Nitro. I'm glad it was Heyman there instead of Lawler. I just think it worked out better. Paul Heyman has got great reactions. I mean, think about how Paul Heyman reacts to things. Think about how he reacted when Brock Lesnar got the 3 count on The Undertaker at WrestleMania 30, remember? I mean, if the fans weren't shocked enough, and if people were automatically thinking, holy shit, they fucked up, Undertaker wasn't supposed to lose, watching Paul Heyman's reaction actually supported that. Paul Heyman literally looked as if he could not believe what he just saw. And when crazy things would happen on WWE, a crazy spot or a crazy angle or something very dramatic, Paul Heyman would put it over like a motherfucker. Remember when Vince was humiliating Trish in Washington, D.C. on Raw, making her strip her clothes off and bark like a dog? As she's getting naked, Paul Heyman screams out on commentary, I came to Washington, D.C. and I'm going to get to see Bush. So he was just great. I mean, highly entertaining. I wish that Paul Heyman could do commentary now. He'd be great. It might be a little annoying hearing him talk about Twitter and plug the goddamn network every 5 seconds for $9.99 in case you haven't heard. But still, I think he'd be a lot better than the crap we hear now. But those days were great. I enjoyed Paul Heyman on commentary for that short time in 2001 when he was doing it. I thought it was awesome. So the invasion angle comes and goes. Paul Heyman is off of commentary because he's basically been fired, takes a few months off. WWE ends up bringing him back in with Brock Lesnar, who had been getting over huge in OVW, and a young guy like that that's so inexperienced and just has that raw talent. They needed to stick him with somebody, you know, with a brain, and they put him with Paul Heyman, and it was a brilliant partnership. Didn't last very long, though. I mean, shit, Paul Heyman was only with Brock from when he came in right after WrestleMania that year of 2002, and then he turned on him at Survivor Series, so it wasn't even that long. But during that time, Paul Heyman really helped Brock get over as a monster, and I thought it was an awesome pairing. Paul Heyman, it was good to see Paul Heyman back in that manager role, too. I mean, I think he was calling himself Brock Lesnar's agent back then, but still, he was a manager. Now, the following year, I think he became SmackDown's head writer. Now, I also think he was the GM of SmackDown, too, and you guys are going to have to help me out. My memory is hazy. I'm pretty sure it was the Vince versus Stephanie match, the father-daughter match. Wasn't the stipulation in that something along the lines of Stephanie lost, she was no longer the GM of SmackDown or whatever? I'm pretty sure that's what led to Paul Heyman coming in, but he also became the lead writer behind the scenes of SmackDown, and they talked a lot about the success of the show during that time. And I remember, I agree, I think SmackDown might have been a little bit better than Raw back then. The talent they had there was awesome. Guys like Brock Lesnar and Kurt Angle and Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit and Edge and Rey Mysterio, I mean, they had a great roster. And Paul Heyman took the job very seriously, and he says he's proud of that accomplishment. A lot of people in the documentary put over the success of SmackDown and how great the show really was and what a great job Paul Heyman did with it. But with all of that genius came a price. Apparently he was incredibly hard to work with. As we've talked about in this review, he's basically rubbed people the wrong way in every single fucking company he's been in. And I think that basically Vince and Stephanie just couldn't take it anymore, and they sent him down to OVW. Now, Paul Heyman, what's interesting is he says in the DVD that he had a 5-year no-cut contract, and nobody else had ever gotten that. So it sounds like he had a clause in his contract that said he couldn't even be fired. I don't know. That might be stemming stemming from the money that he owed Vince McMahon, and maybe they were just keeping him under contract, making him work, to pay off whatever debt he might still owe him, because there's a very interesting story in the DVD extras about this big loan that he got from Vince McMahon. So they get him the hell out of their faces, and they send him down to OVW to work with the developmental talent. Now, Paul Heyman says, hey, they thought that was a demotion, but it's what I enjoy doing. I enjoy developing talent, and I think it was a good place to put him, to be honest with you, and that's where Paul Heyman met and fell in love with CM Punk. They went into great detail on the relationship between CM Punk and Paul Heyman and how much Punk learned from him and how close they became. And Beth Phoenix is another one that was interviewed for this DVD, and she talked great about Paul Heyman because she was in OVW at this time as well, and she talked about how much she learned from him, and sounded like she really enjoyed her time with Paul Heyman. Now, while he's working in OVW, this is around the time that the WWE starts talking about bringing back ECW for the ECW One Night Stand pay-per-view in 2005. I've heard stories of Rob Van Dam saying that he was the one that came up with the idea. I don't know who came up with it, but basically they were going to bring back ECW for one night and have a pay-per-view, and Paul Heyman said it right in this DVD. If that would have been it, that would have been perfect. That's the way it should have been. The whole name of the fucking pay-per-view is One Night Stand. What's the first word? One. Have one throwback show, and that's it. One that can be special and be looked back at for years to come as one of the most special nights in the business. And they fucked it up the next year by bringing back ECW and completely destroying it. But we'll get to that in a minute. Now, ECW, they were telling some stories about how this all came about. Now, interestingly enough, Paul Heyman also mentions a story about how Shane McMahon almost bought ECW in the year 2000. The idea was for Shane to legitimately buy, in real life, ECW, and become the owner and the main promoter for it, and he'll have a lot of money backing it and try to make it a success. Basically, it'll never be on the scale of a WWE, but it can be a competitor, and it was also going to be doubled as a way to give Shane McMahon practice to take over the company when Vince McMahon dies, because back then the plan was still to have Shane and Stephanie run the company. So having Shane own a smaller wrestling company like ECW would be really good practice for when he will take over. So that was kind of the plan. Something happened, fell through, didn't wind up happening. And you fast forward 5 years later to 2005, and they are talking about bringing ECW back. And at first it was going to be an online show on the website, because now, the internet is really cooking here by 2005. We were on it back then just about the same as we are now. Shit was really getting advanced, and WWE was thinking about launching ECW as just an online brand. And if they were able to do that, they probably would have kept it a little bit closer to what ECW originally was than what they wound up doing with it when they put it on TV. So basically, long story short, some TV stations and pay-per-view companies are interested in the ECW brand and support it. WWE puts it on TV, and it becomes this whole corporate thing, and it was a shell of its former self, and it flat out sucked. They said that openly. On the DVD, Joey Styles said the 2006 version of ECW fucking sucked. And earlier on in the DVD, when they were talking about Paul Heyman being the lead writer of SmackDown, he said on the DVD that SmackDown was the bitch of the WWE. So I really liked the way the WWE was kind of letting it fly in this DVD, because you have to. This is Paul Heyman we're talking about. He's controversial as fuck, and there's no way to PG down Paul Heyman. They kept this DVD and documentary real, and I appreciate them doing it. Now, because of how bad ECW was failing and how the relaunch had become a complete joke, it just pisses me off looking back. I know it does all of you as well. I just wish they never would have done that. They got such a fucking hard-on from ECW One Night Stand in 2005 that they just had to do another one. And I think it was one of the biggest mistakes they made, because it completely ruined everything that made ECW special. That One Night Stand in 2005 was, one of the best things I've ever fucking seen. Probably one of my top 5, easily, WWE pay-per-views of all time. That's right. One of my top 5 pay-per-views of all time is an ECW show. Now, I know it was all WWE funded and backed, but they really replicated the old feel and the old atmospheres of ECW perfectly that night, and it was special. But the next year, when they brought ECW back, the One Night Stand pay-per-view was not nearly as good, and of course the relaunch on TV was the worst fucking shit ever. And Paul Heyman was losing his mind. RVD was losing his mind. I just don't think he could take it anymore. Finally, he had a big blow up with Vince. We don't know exactly what happened, and Paul Heyman doesn't get into that much detail about it in the documentary, but he does say that it was so bad that he's surprised that he came back to the WWE. If you would have seen the confrontation that he and Vince had, anybody who's anybody is going to think that there is no way that guy will ever be back working for the WWE. So apparently it was pretty ugly, and given the nature of the type of people that Vince McMahon and Paul Heyman are, that's probably an incredible shouting match that I would love to sit and enjoy. So Paul Heyman finally leaves the WWE, probably with a broken heart, because if he left the WWE, he probably wouldn't have cared. But the way he left watching the WWE completely kill the wrestling company and the three initials that he helped build, had to just be heartbreaking for him. I really still have a lot of hard feelings towards the WWE for what they did to ECW. I was never the biggest ECW fan. A lot of you know that. I still respected what they did. I respected how hard they worked, and I respected the type of promoter and booker that Paul Heyman was. And the way the WWE completely raped it and beat it and took a piss on it and hung it from a tree and threw full beer cans at it pisses me off. They should have quit while they were ahead in 2005 and ended it that night. Now, Heyman's gone. He's out of the WWE now. The documentary next touches on some of the things that he did while he was away from the WWE, like writing the book with Brock Lesnar, creating his online content, Heyman Hustle, which I've taken a look at a couple of times, and he also has the production company Looking for Larry, that does all sorts of marketing and promoting and crazy shit like that. And I think they helped produce the Ultimate Warrior video game commercial that the WWE released last year. So Heyman kept very busy, still as determined and as driven as ever. I follow him on Twitter, and I gotta tell you, he is hilarious. He is friends with so many fucking porn stars. The guy is always doing something. He's always somewhere promoting something. He's got something to say at all times, it seems like. And during his time off, he's had a couple of kids. So now he's a dad. And they talk a lot about in the DVD how, you know, he's matured and he's grown up over the years, and now that he's a father, it's kind of helped balance him out and kind of bring him back down to earth and mellow him out a little bit. So he had changed a lot in the few years that he was gone with the WWE, and the opportunity came for him to come back because Brock Lesnar was returning to the company. CM Punk was a huge star. They knew that if they brought Paul Heyman in, there's a lot of great guys there he can work with. And Heyman talked in great detail about what a great time he's been having in his current role in the WWE. He's probably doing the best work of his career. He's probably the happiest he's ever been, and he's at the most peace probably as well that he's ever been. And I think for the first time in a long time, Paul Heyman is happy. He enjoys his job. It's not stressful. It's fun. And they talk a lot about what a great mentor he is backstage, and they show a lot of footage of guys just talking to him and, and him giving advice and just having a good time, just being around, the young talent and, help molding them for the future. And he even does a really nice shout out to Renee Young at the end of it as well, saying that he has particularly enjoyed, hanging out with her, which I can see why. I love Renee Young. She is fucking gorgeous. But the word on the street is that the WWE has big plans for this girl, provided she can stick around. We've heard some ESPN rumors, things like that. She's really making an impression on people in the media, and the WWE might have a gem on their hands, and she actually could be a future female lead commentator in the WWE. It's quite possible. So he's been especially interested in helping her out, and he mentions her directly in the documentary, saying it's been a pleasure, to get to sit and talk with her. And we've seen their interviews on the Raws, the backstage passes and all this. He's always such a dick to her. And it's amazing how you can watch the way he talks to her in an interview and realize that in real life he absolutely adores her. And I like little Renee Young. I really do. I think she's adorable. I think she's a breath of fresh air, and I think she is really good at her job. So in a nutshell, that's it. That's basically the documentary. Hopefully most of you have gotten a chance to see the DVD by now. If not, I hope this review makes you want to go out and buy the DVD. It's definitely worth watching. Now, normally in my DVD reviews, somewhere in the middle of the review, I'll usually give you a listing of all of the matches and the extras that are on the DVD. But it's different with a manager. It's all fucking promos. The whole goddamn thing is promo after promo after promo. Great shit. Awesome content. I highly recommend going through and watching this stuff. I haven't even had a chance to go through and watch all of the promos myself. There's just too many to list. But the juicy stuff that I was mentioning earlier on in the review is on here in disc number 2. And by the way, I say this in every single review. I know it's crazy. I know everybody's like, GoodMicWork, what the fuck is your problem? But honestly, I do not collect Blu-rays. Don't ask me why. I just don't. I've explained it time and time again. I do most of my wrestling watching and sometimes even movie watching on the computer. I don't really have any use for the Blu-ray DVDs. I do have a few, probably 20 or 30 random movies on Blu-ray, but for the most part, I collect just regular standard DVDs. And by doing this, I understand that I'm sacrificing a lot of extras that the Blu-ray has. So those of you that have the Paul Heyman Blu-ray version, you guys can fill us in the comment section below what I'm leaving out. And I would actually like to know too, because the stories in the extras here are fucking fascinating. So I can only imagine what great little chunks of drama they've inserted into the Blu-ray version. So I'm curious to know. But in disc 2 on the extras, they have several extra stories, and that's where they get into some of the juicier, more dramatic behind-the-scenes stuff, like like the incident with Jerry Lawler and Todd Gordon being the mole in ECW and all of that. He tells a hilarious story as well of driving in a car with Classy Freddie Blassie when he's fucking blind and driving up on the curb and driving like a madman. You know, apparently Paul Heyman's like 14 or 15 years old at the time, in a car with Classy Freddie Blassie, and he's driving all over the streets in the wrong direction in New York City. He apparently scared Paul Heyman shitless, but it was a really funny story. He also told the story of what went down between him and Jerry Lawler when he was making some enemies in Memphis, and Jerry Lawler ended up getting him in the ring and punched him as hard as he could in the fucking face and broke his jaw. And the story that I alluded to earlier on, I don't remember the year now, it might have been 2000, I think it was right before, a year before WCW was bought out. ECW, of course, as usual, was struggling, and Paul Heyman went to visit Vince McMahon in Stamford, and Vince offered to help. He said, "What can I do to help?" And Paul Heyman says, "Give me $500,000 to run my next pay-per-view." And Vince, I guess, wrote him a check or transferred him $500,000 and considered it a loan. So when you hear about that Paul Heyman 5-year no-cut contract, maybe some of that was just to ensure that he was employed so he could pay off that debt. I don't know. But it was a cool story, and it was cool of Vince McMahon to do that. Do you think WCW would have done that? Do you think Eric Bischoff would have lifted a finger to help Paul Heyman? Fuck that. And in addition to one or two just other cute little stories, he talks about what actually got him fired from the creative job on SmackDown. Apparently Raw and SmackDown would have separate conference calls with Vince and Stephanie and all of the creative staff where they would discuss, plans for TV and, their creative direction and all of that. And somehow something happened where they found out that Paul Heyman was listening in on the Raw conference call and not telling anybody about it. He just wanted to secretly listen in to what was going on. Something happened to his phone where the other people on the conference call heard some sort of message saying, "Paul Heyman has left the conference call," some automated message from his phone. And when they confronted him with it, he tried to lie his way out of it. They pulled up his phone records and basically proved it was him. And he tells the funny story on the DVD that, yes, he was listening into the Raw calls just because he wanted to. But on the specific time that he got caught, he actually was not listening in. He was asleep, and his phone battery had died, and the phone had shut off. Now, given Paul Heyman's track record, who's to say this story isn't bullshit? But I thought it was interesting the way he owned up to listening in to the Raw conference calls without anybody knowing. But the one time he got caught and thrown off the creative team for it, he actually did not do it. And of course, they get to the story of the mole in ECW. This was huge news in the wrestling business in the mid-90s when this was going on, because ECW and WWE had already formed their relationship. They were already working together. And then you had Todd Gordon, who I guess in the DVD, the story goes that the reason some of this happened is because he was slighted on the pay-per-view money from the first pay-per-view. Apparently, Paul Heyman's version of this is that he didn't pay Todd Gordon, didn't give him a slice of the money from the first pay-per-view, and that pissed Todd Gordon off to the point where he contacted his friend Terry Taylor in WCW and started working with him to bring some ECW guys into WCW. And apparently they were going to do some sort of an invasion. There was going to be 5 or 6 guys all ready to jump ship at once. Now, this was all hearsay up until this documentary. I mean, the stories have been done on this. This was almost as extensive as the screw job at the time. This was a huge story in wrestling, huge thing to happen, that you had an insider working with an outside company to, help infiltrate their talent. It was fucked up. But nobody really ever knew, if any of this was true and who was the real mole. And was it even Todd Gordon? Was it somebody else? Was it Raven? Was it a wrestler? Was it anybody else like that? Basically, Paul Heyman says in the documentary that he checked Todd Gordon's voicemail, which I've heard versions of this story before. I've been aware of the voicemail part of the story, but Paul Heyman even gives the code on the documentary. Say, just so you know I'm not lying, I had the code. I typed in his code, and I listened to every voicemail, and I got names of who was jumping and when and where and what the details were, and basically had Todd Gordon busted. I don't know what their relationship is today. I'm assuming it's all water under the bridge because they did interview Todd Gordon for this thing. And he is kind of an asshole for doing it. I mean, he does own up to it. His side of the story is that, yes, he was talking to Terry Taylor. Yes, they did discuss if some guys were going. And he's saying, all I was doing was letting the other guy know that WCW was interested. But he was really the middleman between WCW and a lot of these other talents that they were signing. And as a matter of fact, the story's been told more than once, but the bloody brawl that Beulah and Bill Alfonso had, a fucking referee and a valet, had this brutal, bloody brawl that was so crazy and so intense, and they got so hugely over, it actually saved Bill Alfonso's job. So hearing the stories about some of this stuff all these years later is just so, it's just so crazy to me. That was part of the reason why I wanted to buy this DVD. I was dying to hear some of the details, especially of the days in WCW with the Mole and Todd Gordon and all that stuff. So at the end of the day, I don't know if we got the whole story or not, but a lot of holes were filled, and I was happy with what they released. It was really good content, and there were a lot of great stories, and I thought it was just an overall great presentation of Paul Heyman's life. So I hope you enjoyed the DVD and the documentary as much as I did. I am still deciding what I'm going to do next. I don't even know if it's going to be a DVD or a pay-per-view. So keep leaving me all your requests and suggestions below, because I could very well just pick one at random. So I will catch you very soon for Volume 8. Until then, peace.